So welcome everyone to Science Society, and of course a special welcome to you, Tom. We are so grateful that you are sharing your time with us and your research and knowledge. So to give the audience like a brief intro in case they don't know you, Dr. Tom Logan, he did his Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Michigan, and he studies the risk to and resilience of urban systems, and he is focused on transforming how to design and realize our cities in the face of climate change. And he uses risk science, systems engineering, and modeling to adapt our cities. And I think that's such an important field nowadays because we keep designing and building things based on a climate that's, hundreds of years ago. So, so it's thank you so much. And our first question usually is, how did you figured that you are interested in science and research and going into this field? Was it some like childhood dream, or did something happen that it elicited this passion for science, or affinity to go into this field and research?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Um, well, I guess I was always like a really outdoorsy person, and my family was really outdoorsy when we grew up, and I think that um, ultimately like ingrained like a love of the outdoors and the environment, and as we start to see those things changing, or at intermediate school and high school, being like setting up and being part of the environmental clubs and things, kind of really set me on that path. And then just really loved math. Um, did my undergrad degree in engineering, but at the end of my undergrad, I still felt like I had a lot of questions that hadn't been answered. Like, how do we? And I felt like engineers, especially civil engineers, were kind of being trained just to do as they were told, like build another road, build a bridge, like this and that, but not really think about why, or is this actually solving the problem that we're trying to address? And I think that was really kind of what, especially in a way like that made it sustainable, and that really pushed me into thinking. And like in the end of my undergrad, I was like, maybe a PhD is the way to go, and like research is the way to go. I guess like also my mom is a research person just in the horticulture industry or agricultural industry, so different, but yeah. So it was just that there were more questions, and I felt like I still feel like there are there are always more questions, but especially in this like changing environment. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And it's really important questions that you have, and it's kind of surprising that it's surprising that you kept having them and kept following them, because I feel like most of the time when we go through regular regular education, after a while we kind of sometimes lose that and just do whatever everyone else is doing. So it's really interesting that you kept kept going with those questions, and now we talk here about this very important research. So I think you kind of already predicted a very predictable future what will be important. But, most
Yeah,
people ignore
unfortunately.
it. Yeah, so and like for the I wrote to you about the recent paper you published, and if you have like any kind of peek behind the curtain story, how this project came together, was it really hard? Did nobody like want to help you, or was it something people said, oh yeah, was it kind of easy to get people on board and work on it, or were there a lot of obstacles? I don't know, whatever you have. Thank you.
um, oh, I feel like, yeah, it's been like an interesting, like yeah, I love it. I've loved it, but it's been an interesting uh, journey because the and my PhD, I feel like this kind of is like a natural like kind of step out of my PhD. But my PhD was such a weird mix, and I don't think anyone or even like potentially me knew exactly what it was doing, because I really was interested in like urban stuff, like urban systems and like the built environment. But I was also really interested in risk and resilience, and I was doing a paper, like one of my first papers of my PhD, which was really just like a side project that I was kind of interested in. Was like how far do people have to travel to get to their like nearest supermarket, like in a city? So like, I was living in Baltimore at the time, and doing my master's at Johns. Well, I started my PhD at Johns Hopkins, and my advisor moved, so I started my PhD there. And I was like, how far? Like everyone talks about food deserts, and I was like, well, okay, let's actually measure this, and then look at the equity and the underlying like injustices in this access to different urban amenities. And then, like as we were going, I was working on that. My PhD was on like risk and resilience. I was like, what is resilience? Like, what is that actually? What does that mean? Like, we on one hand, a lot of people talk about infrastructure and like you have to really quickly get infrastructure back online, but that's just the like that's like a very civil engineering focus. Like, let's get this existing structure like back working as quickly as possible, even if it didn't really work for a lot of people in the first place. And then on the other hand of resilience, you have this like more qualitative approach, which is thinking about like social capacity, and both of these are really important. But I was thinking, because I was thinking about access, I was like, well, if you don't have access to the things that you need, like on a day-to-day basis, like that's not, you're not resilient. Like, or your community is not resilient, especially if you lose that access. And so that was kind of where we started to merge the access, like some of the urban research, although now obviously like we're thinking about access much more broadly than just in cities, and that risk and resilience perspective. And that was kind of where we like said, well, what's sea level rise going to do to this, and how is that going to change over time? Um, and because we had been like working on this code for ages, I'm like, could we do how much, like how big could we go? Like we've been looking at individual cities. Can we just look at um, can we look at the entire coast of the US? And like the code took months to run, so it was like like we were just like, let's kind of hope that yeah, let's just hope that we didn't stuff anything up and let it run and see what it shows when it comes out, and compare that with like the direct impacts. And so it was kind of like there was that challenge, and we had like I was chatting with one of my the people that I did my PhD with, and she was on board, and she's based at the University of Maryland, kind of looking at similar things with a coastal community there. And so it wasn't really like there wasn't so much of like a challenge of getting people on board. It was just that we didn't really talk about it that much, because it was once you got the code running, we just like waited and crossed our fingers that it didn't break. like, um, and then we're just like we're so interested in what the results were showing, and what that meant for uh, how we adapt and how we think about adaptation.
Yeah, thank you for giving us kind of this background story about your thought process and this thinking of, how difficult would it be for us to access our everyday needs in case, we can't like use our cars and, have access to things that are so fragile, if anything changes, a flood or sea rise. And it's really interesting that we kind of keep ignoring this fact, right? Especially in US cities and in suburban areas, you need to drive a few miles to the next groceries, and without a car, for most people, it's kind of impossible to do that. We are for sure not built to have this resilience, and so that's why this is so important. And I wanted to ask you. I know I wanted to ask you later, but it kind of just falls into this discussion. I don't know if you heard about this. That design to have like 15 minutes that you can access everything you need in 15 minutes walking distance, right? That European cities, I think in Netherlands, people want to design cities that way. But then on social media came this weird theory that politicians want to cage people into 15 minutes walking distance, combined with COVID. So how do you deal with things like that? Like, how do you communicate your science in a way that people don't make up these stories that kind of I don't know how to solve this, but I don't know, maybe you have some good science communication insights story from your side. Maybe not, I don't know. I don't have really
No,
solution
no.
to offer. But if you, I don't know, did you have anything like that? Did you experience anything like that, and how did you kind of cope with it?
Yeah, well, so I last year I released a study on measuring the 500 largest cities in the US and largest cities in New Zealand for their like X minute, like how good are they in terms of 15-minute city-ness. So I've been involved a lot in that space as well. And so a lot of the New Zealand media talk to me about like urban design and that kind of that thinking. But I think like the like misinformation is obviously like a massive challenge that like I don't have the answer for. But I think one of the key things is like trying to share those co-benefits. And I think a lot of scientists don't, I mean, like we don't always focus on like all of the different co-benefits. Like the 15-minute city or the 10, like even better, 10-minute city is so much better. It's better for like even like a lot of people are opposing it because of COVID, but like it's better from a COVID perspective. Like it's better for sustainability. It's better for social, for mental and physical health. And I think like the problem is that like scientists aren't salespeople or marketing people, and nor should they be. But um, I think like we need to figure out, and the media needs to support that as well. Like how do we share, how do we share research, and how do we share like research that's still evolving? Like a single paper is just like one step in the narrative, and yeah, I think that is presents a challenge in terms of like how do we uh, think about like the broader context of how like each study fits in, and what are the like pros and cons of all of those things, and have like that discussion and communicate the uncertainties that we have in our research. And I think that's like one of the key things, and especially one of the things that we learned from COVID around like communicating risk is the countries that did really well were the ones that communicated where the politicians communicated uncertainty, supported by scientists, and built the trust of their communities. And that's still like obviously hasn't worked entirely, but because even in New Zealand we've started to see like that starting to erode. But it's really going to be important for climate change because like we don't know because there is so much uncertainty around like so many aspects of it.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to communicate uncertainty, and it works in certain places. I don't know why in Portugal people trusted like their scientists and doctors a lot, so they just all got the vaccine and so on. But it was very
Mm-hmm.
different from other places. In Germany, for example, was very different. It's interesting phenomena, but yeah, we won't have the solution here. So yeah, the 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 slides are pinned on top of the room for everyone. And Tom, if you want to go through them, yeah, the stage is yours to talk a little bit deeper now about your work. Thank you.
Cool, thanks. Well, I guess I'm one of those people with slides that like really like steps through like has far too many and steps through a lot of them. So I'll do my best to like um, I'll probably just jump. Unfortunately, they're all numbered. But so yeah, the study, like I said, is focusing on like isolation and or at its heart, access and how that changes with sea level rise. Uh, and one of the key metrics that we were looking at here was isolation. And so if you jump to slide 2, one of the like big motivators this is a quote from someone that my colleague at the University of Maryland, Professor Alison Riley, was working with. And this person said, like, look, we just moved from Deal Island Chance, where our house had relatively good drainage and was on slightly higher ground, but we were much more concerned about road flooding in one or two places in particular. And that's the fear. So not so much the flooding on our property, but the loss of access and the hassle and anxiety about whether or not like we can go to the grocery store or if we have to wait until after high tide. And that just they say has just drains on your mind and enjoyment of living in the area. And we're seeing that now in New Zealand a lot, where we've had a major cyclone or a hurricane in a few months ago, and there's significant areas around the country that have been cut off, and like I have been isolated for a long time, and so when on slide 3, like we're thinking about this in terms of long-term climate change adaptation. So the big question is like, how do we target funding and where do we need to be working? And the question then is like, how many people, where and when are we doing that? And currently, on slide 4, the key kind of question that we've been operating around, like traditionally, is someone's home flooded? But as that person said, we have they had fine drainage. Their house was more or less high and dry, but there was that potential for them being cut off. And so that's what we're suggesting on slide 5 and 6 is thinking about property isolation. What do we do, and do we do anything if someone's at risk of being cut off? Because technically their house is fine and their property is fine. So by traditional adaptation thinking, we wouldn't, like our insurance wouldn't kick in, and therefore they would essentially be unsupported. But if we think about these people, this property losing road access because of flooding, then there's that potential to also lose infrastructure, like horizontal infrastructure that's often buried alongside the road. Things like electricity in some places, gas, and water services. Flooding could become more likely because of the high groundwater table, and there could be lots of other impacts. And so suddenly, we need to start thinking on slide 7, like how many people are at risk of isolation versus at risk of inundation? And how does that spatial distribution compare? Like when we're thinking, are we thinking about the same people? If we're targeting funding based on isolation, if we're targeting funding based on inundation, are we also already thinking about those people that are at risk of isolation? And of course, what are the temporal, like, what are the time differences? Is it fine for us to continue to consider inundation? So on slide 9, we show how the number of people increase, the number of people affected or the number of people burdened by sea level rise increases when we consider isolation compared to inundation. And on slide 11, we show how that changes under three different climate change scenarios. So this is the rate of we're changing the rate of sea level rise here. So under a low climate change future on the left-hand side to a high climate change future, and you can see that there is a potential that we get a significant amount of people isolated and inundated in the next by 2100. And so the way that we did that was looking at basically taking the USA census areas and the neighborhood, the smallest census area that we could, and connecting those up to primary schools and fire stations, and under different sea level rise increments, saying, can you still access those? Can you access a school and a fire station? And if not, you're considered isolated. So, as I said, slide 13 basically is saying the number of people that are burdened is significantly higher when we start to think about isolation. But on slide 14, what we're showing is that those people are also going to be affected significantly earlier than we're anticipating. And that basically just shifts the urgency of thinking about this. And this is not including demographic shifts. So there's another paper a few years ago that was looking at how we're continuing to invest and build and populate coastal areas. So there's essentially we need to really start reversing those trends. And on slide 15 was the other question, was how does this change the spatial distribution of the risk? And this is probably one of the like more important questions, is that some, like Florida, for example, you have relatively high inundation, and then slightly higher isolation. But Florida knows that, well, I was going to say Florida knows that it needs to adapt to climate change, but what I'm going to say is that Florida should know that our study doesn't change that kind of importance. But some of the other states where you have communities that are not at risk from inundation, so direct flooding, those states that have high isolation risk, they're the ones that may not be thinking about the need to adapt, may not be receiving or even considered for adaptation funding. So this is where we need to start to broaden our perspective of what does it mean to adapt, and what are the requirements, or what are the triggers that makes a community eligible for adaptation planning. On slide 16, if you're interested, there's a link there to an interactive dashboard that you can explore and zoom in on the different communities. You can toggle the sea level rise amount and change between isolation and inundation. Slide 17 shows how that urgency of adaptation planning changes. This is a fairly esoteric graph but essentially what it's saying is in areas that, when we start thinking about isolation, it, isolation could occur 50 years earlier than inundation. So that's how much sooner we need to be starting to think about this. So in terms of what this means for adaptation, the challenge is, like, as I mentioned at the start, our adaptation funding and our insurance is often based on flood risk alone. And that challenge means that we're potentially underestimating what that burden looks like. And assuming that we don't think it's appropriate for people to stay in homes without access, without horizontal infrastructure, we might see that isolation is forcing people to relocate sooner. That has implications for how we do our planning, how we do our adaptive planning when we think about what are called signals and triggers, which are a way of saying, well, when this threshold is reached, that means action is needed to support a community. So you might think about a really intuitive example of a trigger is once the risk is so high or exceeds the threshold that insurance starts to increase premiums or even abandon areas. That is a trigger for either retreating or relocating the community, or building a seawall, or those starting to think about what that adaptation looks like, and is how we're thinking about how intervention should be made. So I think it's important that we start to think about access as being one of those triggers. Also, it starts to think about not just these direct risks. So we would consider flood risk to a property as a direct risk, but in isolation is an indirect risk. So it's a case of, well, you've had this flood on a road, and then what happens? So, and then people are cut off, or the supermarket is cut off, or the hospital is cut off. But another type of indirect risk is if a flood affects an electricity station, and then a water pump loses power, and then a hospital doesn't have any water, so can't operate, and then someone else, residents don't have access to healthcare. So this is like what's called cascading or indirect risk. And so a lot of our research at the moment is, how do we start to factor in these indirect risks, and how much does that increase the quantum of the risk that we're thinking about? And how do we adapt to that? How do we think about that in terms of making sure people have the things that they need in their day-to-day? But on slide 20, it's essentially isolation is raising that question. Okay, at what point is a property no longer habitable? And generally we consider human rights there's a human right to adequate housing. But like, what do we consider as adequate? Do we think about, like, we do say access to social services, but what does that mean? Is that, and how do we think about isolation and access into that, and infrastructure services into that kind of mix? So, and what's that tolerance for that loss? And of course, that quote from the residents there were like really highlighted the impact on mental health and well-being, and we know that that has cascading or indirect impacts on the local economy. So how do we factor all of this in as we start thinking about it? So slide 21, again, one of the questions that we're posing is, what does property isolation mean? Like, yes, people are cut off, but there's also that risk of impact to their horizontal infrastructure, that potential for groundwater rise and higher seas to reduce the drainage and therefore make flooding more likely. And there could be other impacts. And so that's one of our big questions is, and a lot of our ongoing research at the moment is thinking, how do we think about what those other impacts are? So I'll wrap it up there.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. Yeah, for giving us this insight into all these different factors that we kind of ignore when we talk about climate change. I think especially the mental health factor that kind of persists even like after a hurricane or a heat wave, extended heat wave, where people were kind of in these situations that they can't really escape. The mental health impact on the population is quite significant. And so, yeah, again, I think this is a really important research, and that you're working in and designing cities in different ways. So, are people, I know this is again a very broad question, and I'll promise I'll go more into your
No,
actual
no, no, it's okay.
paper, but are people starting to listen and redesigning? I heard, for example, in German news and in other places that people are discussing to redesign cities for heat waves, but
Yep.
I don't hear too much about the sea level rise and resilience, building resilience there, because I would assume it's just way more expensive. So are people like cities investing in this
Yeah,
now
so
that, yep.
huge conversation in New Zealand at the moment, and in lots of different communities around around the US coast. And isolation is now definitely being considered in that, in terms of land use planning and asset management. Thinking about stranded assets as well from different infrastructure providers. So it's still early days, but yeah, definitely it's becoming a real part of the conversation, and largely because at least in New Zealand we've been seeing those impacts. Like, we're seeing people being cut off and isolated. So it's a shame that people don't hear the warning, but they definitely start to understand when they're reading it actually playing out, or when it's happening to communities that they either live in or know about.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. And Joyce, I wanted to give you a chance to ask a question or comment, and yeah.
Yeah, I missed a lot of the first part of it. Are you considering places like Venice, Italy, and I'm just curious about some of the places you're considering because I missed that part of it. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, so the study so far was focused on the coast of the US, and I'm doing another study in New Zealand. Venice obviously is a quite a different story, because they've adapted to like not having road access. And I was in Venice a few months ago, and it's like so cool because they're not not reliant on, well, there are no, like, very few, if any, cars on the island. But it kind of there's something called the adaptation effect, which basically means that communities that aren't familiar with different hazards are like more prone to them because they don't know how to manage it. And I think that's where, like, we need to start transitioning some of our more car dependent areas to being more mode agnostic. So being more like in New Zealand, there's like very few ferries, even though we're such a coastal nation. So there are going to be different. The scale of the problem is going to be quite different based on that community and that kind of already the existing culture and norms.
Yeah, thank you. Um, it is an interesting topic. I had not really thought about it, so it's really great that you're researching it.
Thanks.
Thank
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I think it's interesting how some cities along the way have adapted really well to something that will be prevalent in more places. Venice, and then I keep saying Sevilla, for example, is really well designed for heat, for dry heat. And I think Singapore is very well designed for humidity and heat. So I think there are a few cities that people can kind of see as an example, but not too many, I would assume. So yeah, it's interesting, that example. Thank you, Joyce. Hi, Dan. Did you have a question or comment that you wanted to join to tell us?
Yeah, well, I'm just joining late, but I think the conversation is about how with sea level rise, homes will not just be flooded, but they'll be isolated from other areas by flooding sort of around them as opposed to on them. But I think that's correct. And then I would also suggest though that if you're looking at that, it's not going to happen like that directly. What's going to happen is there will be destruction of infrastructure all over the place. One example would be, wastewater treatment plants, which are very often near the water. They'll go first, and that will affect water. Just water supply, food supply. All these things will be going haywire all at the same time. In other words, we won't be looking at solving climate adaptation problems by looking at individual problems. It's going to be multiple things all happening simultaneously that will make it much more difficult to address them, because you'll be, I think the technical phrase is all hell will be breaking loose. So I think so, but this is an interesting thing because I actually haven't seen this particular thing before, where you take a look at how many homes are going to get isolated. But again, I think we're not going to deal with it just because they're isolated. We're going to deal with it because infrastructure all over the place is collapsing around all of those homes, the ones that are underwater, the ones that are isolated, and the ones that are not isolated as well will be having trouble too. Thanks.
Yeah, and the isolation is a really good proxy for that all hell breaking loose, because of the co-location of a lot of assets with roading infrastructure. So it's a good proxy for starting to think about where those areas are that need to be considered and how soon they need to be considered. And like, we're definitely seeing that it is definitely more of an indication of communities and rather than individual property. And there are significant numbers of New Zealand communities and communities in sort of the northern part of the east coast and the northern part of the west coast of the US, where there are communities that are dependent, that are up high. Potentially a lot of their services are up high, but the main road in and out is along the coast. And so there are those kind of issues, and it's important at the very least to be aware of where they are and what that could look like. But yeah, definitely there's no, a lot of, like, all of our research is thinking about this, like, and kind of the whole point of the research is to be thinking about those interconnected systems. And other research that we're doing is looking at like those cascading or indirect effects, so that you can see how, well, if the electricity plant fails, then the water pump isn't working. But it's yeah, there are still, how do we start to quantify that, or or at least estimate where those effects might be occurring, what the magnitude of those effects are, and kind of when they might occur, is really important for on the ground, like, adaptation planning.
Yeah, but there's this moment in time where things are falling apart and your government is still functioning, and then just a little while later, there isn't any government functioning. There isn't any response to the problems you're trying to deal with. You're kind of on your own. I mean, Kevin Anderson, climate scientist, who said famously, it's over 10 years ago, he said this. He said, at 4 degrees, end of the century when we're getting serious sea level rise, maybe by the way, as much as 10 feet by then, if the AMOC shuts down in mid-century, but even with 6 feet, that's still a lot. But he said, at 4 degrees of warming, which is what we're on track for if we don't start taking some serious action, that 4 degrees of warming is incompatible with an organized global community. which is a phrase you have to think about for a moment, but then you think about, I think it's very much related to what we're talking about right now, this idea of adapting the way we adapt today to flooding and to hurricanes. We're talking about a very different time when things are happening happening on a constant basis. There's no time to rebuild, there's no money to rebuild, they're focused on other things. And so we have to it's a quote that I made in another clubhouse room this morning, is that James Lovelock, who's a famous scientist who died a couple years ago, said he said it's too late, to do all these kind of minor things that we're trying to do. And someone said, don't say that because it gives us nothing to do. And he answered, on the contrary, it gives us plenty of things to do. It's just not the things you want to do. So I think that's what, when we get into adaptation planning, I think that's something we should keep in the back of our mind, is like, what will the world actually be like when we're adapting? And therefore, what should we be doing now to avoid the need for adapting? Now, we will need to adapt. We have to do it right now. There's no question about it. But if we kind of give up on mitigating and only go to adaptation, then I think we've lost the game, as they say. Thanks.
Right, and I don't think, there's certainly, you won't be hearing from me that we're not mitigating, but especially in New Zealand, like, that's a big question, is what do we do if or when global systems shut down? And it is really interesting because I do a lot of work with communities and doing that planning, but it's probably the wrong approach to go in and say, look, we're all fucked, and we, like, even though that is, like, frankly a massive concern of mine and many of the people on my team, but, like, we have to take them on a journey as well, and starting to identify where those areas are, and how do we start to support them so that we can say, well, look, these are some of the options, but maybe the best option is to just move out of that area entirely, because you're right that we, like, that one, like, and it's almost already here in New Zealand, is that we're just in this constant state of this an emergency somewhere. There's some flooding, there's some disaster, and so you're in this, as you say, like a constant state of rebuild. And how do we get communities to, like, really start to have that long-term thinking so that they can be more, like, long-term sustainable, both from a resilient adaptation perspective and from that mitigation perspective? But it's definitely a
it's funny you
broad
mention New Zealand,
conversation.
because when people ask me where should we move, I tell them New Zealand.
We're
That's
doing
the
our
place
best
to go, because you want a place that's civilized and is as far away. Because what do you need? You need food, shelter, and security, right? That's what you need. And New Zealand is pretty good on the first two. And by the way, your geography is good too, because you're hilly,
right.
you're mountains. You go up from the coast, and that's good. And the last thing you want is security, and being the most isolated kind of country. That also, I
does
looked
help
at
sometimes.
the drought maps. This is old stuff, and I'm sure they change over time. But when you look at drought maps for the 2060s, it looks really dire, most places of the world, except for New Zealand. It was like the one place where it wasn't like an incredible drought. And of course, Australia's getting walloped right now.
Hmm.
So it's a good place to go. And so yes, I would focus on adaptation in New Zealand. It's a place.
Yeah,
It's a, and you might also want to figure out how to handle all the refugees that are going to be coming there too.
I know. I know. There's definitely a lot of interconnected challenges that are yeah starting to
Yeah,
be
and I
very
think
front of mind.
New Zealand, at least during the pandemic, seemed to have good leadership and maybe sensible people. And
Yeah,
I don't know
yeah,
if it's always the case, but that's what I heard. Your prime minister helped you get through the pandemic better than a
yeah,
lot of people.
fantastic.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and I was also going to say, I think in a way, I mean, a lot of the benefit of what you're doing too may just be that because you are pointing out additional people that will be more affected in the shorter term, you're going to be educating groups of people that may not have been very educated about it. And now it's
Mm,
become more concrete, and maybe they will take more action politically to influence their governments. So that's
yeah,
another thought.
and that's a really good point. And making it more personal rather than just being, oh, it's the problem of those people over there. Um, and yeah, especially when like we've got an election coming up, and it still is like unfathomable to me that it's not the big election issue. Like even with the heat waves overseas, the hurricane that we had earlier in the year, the flooding that we've had recently, um, people are still like, yeah, very preoccupied with other things.
Humans
So
are not designed to handle.
yeah,
No, they're not. I mean, to think about how we evolved. We evolved worrying about, a tiger going to eat you right now. I mean, a problem 2 weeks out was not something you worried about. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
whether you
exactly.
survived or not, right? So our brains are very focused on being certain kinds of threats. I did a talk on this. It's the threats are whether it's visible, immediate, has historical precedent, personal consequences, simple causality, and caused by an enemy. And climate change, until very recently, had none of those. But a lion showing up had like all of those. And now it's becoming visible. It's becoming a little immediate, somewhat.
Hmm.
And I think that's the only reason we're even paying any attention to it in the last few years. We didn't pay
Yeah,
any attention really before that, and we're still not doing anything. But so it will change as things become more visible, become more of a real current threat, and then we'll do more action. But I know the fact that we don't vote on it, even though people like in the United States, I think 70% of the people say they're concerned and want action on climate, and like no one votes on it, right?
yeah,
So it's not a priority.
I do.
Um, yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
well, yeah, everyone in this room maybe, but we're a small number here, so yeah. So that to me, that's actually the biggest challenge is the psychology of it all. The
Yeah,
fact that
totally.
we don't know how to we know all the science we need to know. I mean, we'll learn more, but we certainly know all about how dangerous it is. We even know, you know, pretty roughly what's going to happen. We don't know exactly when and where, but we know roughly what's going to happen. It's
Yep,
already
and it hasn't
happening.
changed much in the last 30, like that kind of science hasn't changed much in the last 30 years, and we're still,
Well, I would
I
say the
think
last
that's the
6 months has
scary part.
changed. It's getting a lot more serious very quickly right now,
Oh,
shockingly
yeah,
so.
in terms of, yeah, we've known that this is coming for so long, and I think that's one of the things that we need to, uh, one of our challenges as well is keeping the energy amongst people that are aware of this, and I'm always concerned when my friends and colleagues and researchers in the space just start to like say how they wish they just did other jobs that weren't related, so they could just not have to think about it and be worried all the time. But yeah, it's a challenging space, but we can't just yeah can't just ignore it.
I think it's actually the most exciting area to work in and the most inspiring
I,
area to work in.
I
I mean,
find it really
what
motivating. Yeah.
what else can
Um,
you think of that's like in fact, what happens is like nothing else really seems important, right?
yeah.
It's like, what? You care about what? who cares about that?
Yeah, I know. I
and,
try not to say that to my
but
colleagues
it
that
makes
don't
life
work on
easier
this.
in some ways. You don't sweat the small things anymore.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, whenever I'm in a lot of these rooms with Dan, and whenever we get into this discussion, oftentimes things will get kind of dark, and I'll try to turn it around and say, this should activate you. Don't get discouraged, because unfortunately, in the U.S., a significant number of environmentally concerned voters do not vote because they're
Yeah,
too discouraged, and they could make all the difference because it's kind of close in our elections, a lot
yeah.
of them. So.
I know. I think it's especially rough because you guys, like as Americans, have so much more influence. Like a vote in the US in terms of like broader global climate influence compared to the vote that we have in New Zealand. So, but you're right. Like, and I think it's definitely one of the things that gets me out of bed like every day is like this is the most important thing, and just figuring out how to. I think like being a researcher is such a privileged position because I do get to work on what I think is the most important thing. So
Hey, yeah, and
yeah,
in your spare time, you should come to Clubhouse. We have a lot of environment rooms, and Dan has a great room on Sundays about we talk about climate. And he has climate scientists on sometimes, like just the other day. So it's
cool.
really
Yeah,
cool.
no, it's great to connect in.
Yeah, we had Leon Simons on who told us that next year will be 1.7 C above the pre-industrial temperature.
Yeah,
That's pretty mind.
yeah.
You hope that
Yeah.
will
Okay.
trigger political action. We'll see. I think I'm naive, but I hope. Thanks.
I'm hoping as well. I'm with you on that.
Yeah, I agree. And very practical decisions need to be made. In the last storm in North Carolina, the Pfizer, um, a big Pfizer production plant was destroyed, and which leads then to, not having enough medications of certain medications available right now for the population. So, the permits to build things in certain areas should just not be given out until further notice, basically, that are important for, the survival of a large population. Um, I mean, data centers already have kind of this risk management. I don't know why, pharmaceutical companies and all of these didn't do that. I guess their risk management is very different. But do you see, because I saw that you also do consulting right in this areas, are companies hiring scientists like you to have like a risk management plan for the future, or is that not happening at all?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, well, I feel like consulting is a interesting word for what we do. Essentially, I was doing this research and was getting very frustrated that no one was well, like you write a paper and what happens? Like no one really looks at it or sees it, and it's not useful. But we were doing a lot of work as part of the research with communities, and I wanted to make sure that it was like actually being translated and communicated in a way that was useful. And so we were using interactive dashboards, but uh, in order to actually like make that work, I we needed a team of developers, and so yeah we've set up a team that does this and works for councils around New Zealand and works for companies around New Zealand, and shows what those risks are, what the how they're changing over time, like right down at the very like the asset level, but also right up at the regional level. And so, like essentially, it's yeah mostly very much like translating that research into impact. And the company was the best way and easiest way to like actually set that up in order to make that jump and difference. So, but it is suddenly like, I think the feeling that I'm getting is that the switch has been flicked in a lot of ways, and it is the conversation in many companies around like, what are they doing? Not for the like, largely for economic reasons, but like at least it's happening. Um, and but there's still a huge amount of work and research needed into how we actually do that in a way that's impactful and forces them not to just think about their risk, but also mitigation at the same time, so they're doing things properly. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I know that, you know, scientists want always to be sound and, data based solutions. And but isn't in this case the future quite unpredictable? Like, is there a way to kind of say, this is the closest we can get to have this prediction, and this could be the solution, and we design it that way because we don't have a better way to predict what the future entails? Like, do we have to move to just faster reaction? I'm also thinking about the Canadian fires that
Yeah.
are causing, millions and millions of people being exposed to this polluted air. Kids growing up with that, and um, I just think, sometimes, because we are very quick at polluting, right? We don't think about the consequences. Do we
Yeah.
need to be quicker at trying to solve it? Like I was saying, why don't we try to do cloud seeding in the spring so it doesn't get as bad? But then people say, you don't know the outcome. But we keep doing, we keep polluting the air without thinking running prediction models. So why don't do something that could maybe prevent, loss of a lot of also CO2 uptake, right? What these forests do and production of oxygen. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think like the way that we're managing the uncertainty is through like what we call adaptive planning, or like a dynamic approach. So where we it is like trying to make the system slightly more agile or more nimble. It's still like society's not really built to do that. So there's a lot of structural changes that are necessary, but we are seeing that starting to happen in parts of New Zealand. I think, but it is like how embracing uncertainty. But I'm still like definitely of the, I would take like a precautionary approach with a lot of the like geoengineering, which yeah, I'm. Well, I think we need to stop polluting, and figure out how to do like carbon extraction. I wouldn't be super quick to um, start putting out other things into the atmosphere, just because of the potential to like really yeah, screw things up more, until we're like. But you're right. There needs to be that balance between certainty um, and uncertainty. But I definitely think that we need to be reducing emissions as a higher priority before doing some of those uh, other interventions. But there are definitely other people that are more informed on, scientists that are more informed on that kind of balance and the trade-offs than I am.
I know what comes up in our discussions with regard to, you might call it geoengineering, but um, they've pointed out that, that we've done, there are natural experiments with volcanoes putting a lot of sulfur dioxide up into the air and cooling the planet for a year or two. And so that might be the least dangerous thing to do, because if you put it up in the high atmosphere, it could like last for a year. And volcanoes do it anyway. Anyway. That's just
Mm.
one possibility. Until we can get everything, because everything is slow. All the things that we need to do need to be scaled up, and we don't even have the political will to do them yet. And so they'll take a long time to get going. And in the meantime, we may get into a lot of trouble. So anyway.
Yeah, thanks. But Katarina, I need to jump to my next meeting. It's
Oh,
just gone
yes,
nine
of
o'clock
course.
here.
Yeah, of course.
Um,
Well, thank you so much for coming again. And we want to, it was really an honor speaking with you. And we want to really cheer you on for the work you're doing. And we will be really curious to follow your work with the next steps and publications. And I hope you get, a lot of funding and a lot of people listen to you. It's
thank
our
you.
hope to survive. Basically, it's not altruistic at all. So,
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
well,
I'm going to
yeah,
tell other people about your work and refer them to you.
yeah,
well, thank you
exactly.
very much for the invitation to join you guys.
Yeah,
It was a fun conversation, and thanks for hosting.
yeah, wonderful.
Uh,
And yeah, Dan is also really a great person. If you want to join him sometimes in his rooms, it's really great rooms he runs. So, and thanks everyone. And yeah, Tom, I hope we'll hear you again someday. Yeah, again, thank you, and we wish you all the best.
cool. Thanks, everyone. All the best.
Uh,
Bye.
Bye. I'll close the room in 3, 2, 1. Bye, everyone. Thank you.